All right, hi folks, this is Larry Mussolino. I wanted to give you a few examples from the Unit 2 graded practice in my math lab. So I want to help you get started here. So let's take a look at a few typical examples from this Unit 2 graded practice. All right, let me look at this example here. It says 1 gallon of a driveway sealant covers an area of 200 square feet. How many gallons are needed to cover 1,000 square feet? Okay. By the way, folks, just to mention to you, when you see this exponent 2 on this FT here, this is a way to write square feet. Now that exponent 2 doesn't apply to the number 200. That exponent 2 is only applying to that notation for feet. So really, this is a units, square feet. We see feet to the exponent 2. Okay, well, this is an example of what's called a proportion. And a proportion is a way to solve a problem where two quantities are proportional. So, if the size of the driveway increases, I'm going to need a proportionally larger amount of sealant for the driveway. All right, so what I'm going to do here is first take this unknown quantity. How many gallons do I need for a 1,000 square foot drive? I'm going to call that X because that's the unknown quantity. So this unknown quantity is going to be X. And then what I'm going to do is set up two fractions equal to each other. So I'm going to set up two fractions equal to each other. On the top of the fraction, I'm going to put the number of gallons that are needed. And on the bottom of the fraction, I'm going to put the area of the driveway. And then I'm just going to write down the two examples that I have. Let me go to the first example. It said 1 gallon covers 200 square feet. So that means 1 gallon covers 200 square feet. Okay, so this first sentence allowed me to write this fraction here on the left. Let me go to the sentence on the right. X gallons covers 1,000 square feet. So I'm going to put an X here and make this 1,000 here. All right, so I set one fraction equal to another, and I just had to be careful to set up the fractions in the same way, meaning I put gallons on the top of the fraction and the area of the driveway on the bottom of the fraction. Now I'd like to solve this equation for X. Well, when you have one fraction equal to another, you're allowed to do an operation it's called cross multiplying. What it means is you can take these quantities and multiply them together and set it equal to the multiplication going this way. You can kind of see it looks like a cross here, an X, right? So this allows us to multiply on these diagonals. All right, so let's do it. I'm going to have 200 times X. That's the multiplication going this direction. And that's going to equal 1 times 1,000, which is the multiplication going the other way. But 1 times 1,000 is just 1,000. All right, last step, I want to solve this equation. Well, because X is being multiplied by 200, my goal is to get X by itself. Well, if X is being multiplied by 200, I'd like to get rid of or cancel out that multiplication. The way you cancel out a multiplication is you use the opposite of multiplication, which is division. So I'm going to divide both sides by 200. Whatever operation you do to one side of an equation, you always have to do the same exact operation to the other side. So if I'm going to divide the left side by 200, I've got to divide the right side by 200. Well, on the left side, I have 200 divided by 200. That cancels out. I'm left with just X. And on the right side, I have 1,000 divided by 200. Well, that's 5. So my final answer here is X equals 5. So I'm going to need 5 gallons for this 1,000 square foot driveway. And if you think about that for a minute, that makes sense because the size of the driveway was going from 200 square feet to 1,000 square feet. That's increasing by a factor of 5. Well, that means I need 5 times as much sealant. So instead of 1 gallon, I need 5 times as much, which is 5 gallons. Okay, well, but sometimes the numbers don't work out quite as nicely. That's why setting up this proportion is important, because even if the numbers were not that easy to work with, you could still calculate an answer by using this kind of a setup we call proportions. Now, folks, I want to remind you that you can click this question help button for many questions. Let me go to the next example, and we'll take a look at this one. Notice here, if I click the question help, that there are many options. Remember, help me solve this. We'll show you a similar worked out example step by step. View an example, help me solve this, shows you this exact example worked out. View an example shows you a similar example worked out. Video will show you a short video. Ask my instructor will send an email to your instructor. All right, well, let's take a look at this question. It says the tuition at a certain college was $21,371 last year, but it increased 5.2%. How much is this year's tuition? Well, I know the answer has to be a number larger than 21,371, because remember, it increased by a little more than 5%, so of course the tuition had to go up. So how do I calculate this year's tuition? Well, when they say the increase is 5.2%, it really means 5.2% of last year's tuition. So they didn't really say that in the problem, but that's really what's implied here. The tuition went up by an amount of 5.2% of last year's tuition. So let me work this out. Now, I'm going to write down 5.2%. And what I want to calculate now is the increase amount. So this is how much the tuition has gone up. They're telling me that it went up by 5.2%, but I know that means 5.2% of last year's tuition. Now, the word of in this kind of a context really is going to translate into a multiply symbol. So many times when you see the word of, it will imply multiplication. And last year's tuition, I know because that was given in the problem, that's $21,371. So let me just do this multiplication. This will tell me the increase. Now, before I do this on my calculator, let me change percent into decimals. The way you change a percentage into a decimal is you move the decimal point 2 positions to the left. So that's going to be 0.052 times 21,371. Okay, remember this is just the amount of the increase. So this is a job for my calculator. I'm going to go plug this into my calculator, and I'm getting the answer 1,111 and 0.292 cents. Now, I know in the end I'm going to round because it says round to the nearest dollar. But I'm going to do that rounding at the very end. All right, now what we just found was the increase. But I need to know how much is this year's tuition. So I want to know this year's tuition. Well, this year's tuition is going to be taking the old tuition. So this year's tuition is going to be equal to last year's tuition plus the amount of the increase. So that's going to be 21,371 plus the amount of the increase, which we know is $1,111. So now I'm going to add these numbers together. Could do this on my calculator. And so I'm getting $22,482.292. Now let me do the final rounding. It says round to the nearest dollar. Well, I'm going to circle this 2 here because that's what they want me to round to. That's the ones position, basically. But remember, if you want to round a number, you got to look over to the right to make your decision about rounding up, rounding down. When I look over to the right, I see the number 2. That tells me to round down, which means leave this 2 in the red box as is. So my final answer here is going to be 22,482 $482. Okay, folks, so the key to this problem was recognizing that when they said the tuition increased 5.2% from last year to the current year, they really implied to you that the increase was based on 5.2% of last year's tuition. And then the word of really means multiplication. So I took 5.2% and multiplied it times last year's tuition. That gave me an increase amount of about $1,111. I added that to the previous year's tuition. That got me the new tuition, which of course went up because there was a 5% increase. All right, folks, hope this is helpful as you're working in the Unit 2 My Math Lab assignment.